One should be flowing in now. Welcome, everyone. Hello. Hope everyone's staying safe and dry around the country at the moment. Okay. So we'll just give it a minute or so while everyone keeps flowing in. While we're waiting for everyone to join, might just go through our background and housekeeping for the day. So welcome to Impact Innovations event today on Stage Gate Design to Deliver Outcomes. So my name's Ali Connors from Impact Innovation, and we'll also be joined by our Managing Director today, Brian Ruddle. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
So now today's topic has actually come from a lot of discussions that we've been having with our network recently around how do you practically design a stage gate process that not only supports your innovation program objectives, but is sustainable in the long run. So what we've done is we've collated a series of 10 questions that we'll run through, which is hopefully going to be able to be taken away with you all today and utilised in your future projects. Okay, now we've designed this session to be interactive. So along the way, we would love to hear everyone's thoughts, experiences, and ideas as we run through the session. But before we get started, just for best practice, we'll run through some housekeeping. I'll just keep admitting people as well. Okay, so your screen should look like this. So to adjust your view settings, simply click the view options at the top of your screen. And so that the event can flow smoothly, for now, all participants have been muted, but if you'd like to ask a question at any time, please feel welcome to utilise the chat function. Brian and I will both be monitoring the chat, so we'll make sure that we'll get to all of your questions and comments throughout the day. In addition, if you're having any tech issues at all, please let us know in the chat function as well. We're also recording the session today. A few people were unable to make it, but requested the recording, so we'll send a copy to those and to everyone that's here as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, Brian and I will be running you through the event, and quickly by way of background, so our team at Impact Innovation focuses on providing practical innovation solutions that deliver impact. So this is in the form of strategy development, commercialization support, and skills and development training. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Okay, so with that all being done and dusted, let's get started. So as mentioned, we're going to run through the 10 key questions to designing effective stage gates, but we'll also touch on key elements, which will come to no surprise to most of you on what is needed for a stage gate process. And then finally, we'll discuss what actions you can take away. So when thinking about what's needed for a stage gate process, we're really talking about what's needed for effective governance and decision-making for your innovation system. So this diagram that some of you would have seen before is built upon the ISO 56002 standards on innovation management and provides a bird's eye view on the key elements that make up an innovation system within an organisation. So when we're talking about stage gate processes, we're really talking about the operations within the system and what's needed to drive that forward. So when thinking about the three key elements, again, no surprise, that's needed for a stage gate. We're thinking about information on each idea or initiative and its level of maturity. We're thinking about the criteria to determine the fit and the support for the organisation for the initiative. And then lastly, who is responsible for that decision making? So this all sounds pretty straightforward, but as we know, innovation is never that simple, and it's really challenging to design a process that can be integrated within an organisation and that can adapt to changing environments, both internally and externally. So when considering the challenges commonly faced, we would love to take a moment just to gather everyone's thoughts. If you did want to pop some ideas or past challenges encountered when designing stage gates into the chat, We'll run through them quickly as a group. And while we're waiting for everyone to do this, Brian, I'd love to hear from yourself. What challenges do you commonly see?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks, Ali. And welcome, everyone. It's great to see everyone. We've got a heap of people who have been able to join us today, but it's been quite amazing the number of people that have registered for this event as well, because it is really challenging. But coming back to your question, one of the big things that we see is that a lot of stage gates are developed from the innovation manager's perspective to turn an idea and to take it through a process to develop the idea. So if you're thinking of a left to right sort of funnel, it's sort of focusing more on, well, ideas have come through, how do I sort of step it through from left to right? What we tend to find is that that often hits bottlenecks later in the funnel. So the first stage or two often worked really well, and then it becomes really hard to shift ideas or initiatives all the way through that funnel to get adoption or outcomes. Because, and we'll talk a lot about this, and this is where a lot of the questions today will be coming from, is sort of looking more at, well, what information is actually needed to achieve adoption, and starting with the, if you like, the right-hand side of a funnel first. About the decision makers, the requirements and things like that to actually get something out of the funnel, rather than worrying about stuff coming in to the funnel. So that's probably the key thing that we see.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. We've got a lot of great comments coming through the chat as well. So one size doesn't fit all.
Yep.
So stage gates need to be flexible, 100%.
Just on that point too, it's often a case sometimes of having multiple funnels, depending on the initiatives, depending on the stakeholders that are involved, depending on the risk elements, and the stage of maturity of the ideas, whether they're process type ideas or they're very early stage research type concepts coming through. So yeah. Yeah,
definitely. And backing that up, Callum's mentioned having stage gate and diversion based on urgency of customer sale opportunity. So thinking about those different pathways from trial, POC to product, not sticking to the criteria that is set, and flexing all the time until the process is no longer functioning. That's a great challenge. Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. No, this is fantastic. Okay, well, so we all know that it is challenging. I think we can all agree onto that. So let's get into what our checklist is that might be able to help everyone moving forward. And what I'll do, Brian, I'll hand over to you to run through these 10 points. And what I'll do is I'll keep monitoring the chat. And if anyone has any comments or questions as we go through it, pop it in and we'll keep this very conversational.
Yep, that's great. Thanks for that, Ali. And I suppose just before we really step into it, we use a lot of these questions when we run workshops with clients to sort of start to identify why a stage gate system isn't working, or why it's getting essentially blocked or not achieving the outcomes. And so, that's the purpose of sharing them today. As Ali said, we've been having a lot of conversations around stage gates lately. So the first one here is sort of that whole process to mobilise internal resources. Before I sort of step through this, if you see on the right-hand side there, so this is a diagram of for the group over in the UK put together, looking at the challenges with design-led thinking within a system. So design-led thinking is a big approach at the moment. Everyone seems to use that term. What we tend to find is it works really well with business to consumer or government to consumer type initiatives. But as soon as you get into B2B or government to business type initiatives, it stalls a little bit. And so what it's showing is the usual sort of double diamond approach, coming to a product or service, and then that product or service hits the system. And so if anyone's interested with this, we've got other materials where we talk about the need for systems, or how to manage that, this issue of a system. Because when that product or service hits the system's got this natural immune response. And so it's a bit like the virus hits our body and our body rejects it because it doesn't fit. And so this is, I suppose, a challenge with a lot of stage gate processes as well, is that if the stage gate process is built around the ideas and progressing them through to a product or service without taking into account the system that that product or service is going to be deployed within, well, then that's where we start to get blockages. So a lot of the questions will start actually referring more to around this concept of how do you actually work within systems to get outcomes and adoption. So the first one is looking at what's the process to mobilize internal resources. So as we take an early stage idea and we put it all the way through into hopefully business as usual or sometimes licensing to other entities, we're wanting to mobilize resources. And so, it's sort of start in terms of designing a stage gate, it's sort of how do you mobilize the resources within your organization? So it's, people, it's decision-making support, looking at how resources are shared across divisions. Like there's often when we're setting up innovation systems, we're wanting to actually break down silos within an organization, and we start off wanting that, but then when we sort of get ideas halfway through a stage gate process, we're needing to get resources from other divisions and get them involved. Well, how's this done within the organization? Is there a process to mobilize resources from one division to work with another one? Now, we often assume that it's just going to work really easily, but often it's very difficult. And it's useful to sort of ask a lot of these questions to understand this resource mobilization piece, because then it starts to help to define, well, how do we manage our stages to be able to mobilize these resources when we need them mobilized to help with validation processes and the like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think another point to consider is touching on having those different stage gates or different pathways. Is there a path of least resistance? So could you really build a stage gate around a particular area of the organisation that heavily involves ideas within their BAU? And then could you potentially tap into that in a first instance and scale from there?
Yep.
We do have another comment in the chat as well. So this is Carol from the Innovation Centre at ANSTO. So she is saying that she completely agrees systems thinking is critical. So it turns from being a nice idea to actionable and valuable. Thanks, Carol.
Yeah.
Okay, so number 2, financial delegations.
So this is another one, and within most organisations there's actually established financial delegations as to who has authority to sign off on different budget levels. So, is it that a certain level is able to sign off on $20,000 expenditures? Is it, for some organisation, if it's more than 20,000 or 50,000, it needs to go to senior execs, and then some, you need to actually go to board levels. I suppose it's similar to this mobilising of resources, but the stage gate needs to, again, hopefully progress an idea all the way through to deployment. And in terms of getting that sign off, how does that work? Because if you set up a stage gate process that doesn't actually engage the CFO at the right time or the board at the right time, then that mobilisation part, and again, often later in the stage gate system, it starts to falter, and a lot of these blocks start coming up. So sometimes it's really simple, but again, it's just a question to ask about what that currently is, and then looking at it from the perspective of, well, if it's not going to work for the stage gate, that's fine. I'm not saying fully adopt what the current internal processes are, but it's about recognizing them and then start to say, well, actually, we need to change that. And then having these conversations around changing the financial authority or getting permission to sort of have a budget that you can allocate as an innovation manager based on criteria or whatever. But so I'm not, with all of these things, I'm not saying that you just accept an internal system or process. but that's essentially the starting point in a lot of ways. And then it's about changing that if that's going to be required to be able to manage an effective innovation program. So, and it's also the third dot point there is really important, and it picks up on one of the earlier comments. For different types of initiatives, you may need different types of delegation as well. So process improvement, for example, may not be a real heavy burden on, say, a budget, but it could be a heavy burden on personnel resources internally. So you might have different delegations for different stage gate systems, depending on the initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well with understanding who's involved in those processes, Brian, and as you're touching on, if things do need to change, is it going to benefit the other stakeholders that you're talking to as well? So try to put yourself in their shoes and not just think about the initiative that you're working on.
Yeah, and I suppose just wrapping up this point, it seems really obvious, but what we've found is that often this question isn't asked. And so coming back to my earlier point, a stage gate system may have been built out from, we're going to collect all of these ideas and we've got 100 ideas, and how do we whittle them down into something that's manageable? And so the front of funnel stuff generally works really well, but not knowing the internal financial delegations can be a blocker so that you can't get things out the other end.
Definitely. Okay, so number 3, what is the resource budget validation projects?
Yep, so this comes back a little bit probably mid-stage within a funnel. Generally, it's sort of, is there going to be only one funding decision, or are you looking at feasibility, proof of concept funding? And again, this is going to come back down to the level of maturity of the ideas that are coming through, but then also what resources that you're thinking of needing to actually be able to run through that validation process. So if you're going to have a couple of different stages of funding, well, then obviously that's going to probably extend out the number of stages that you'll have in a stage gate system. And so again, it's just starting to look at this from how we're going to mobilise things, because also if you're going to have feasibility funding at, say, a lower level, you might need a lower level of information at that particular stage. You may be able to approve that yourselves as innovation managers or innovation team members, but then later on you bring others in. And so again, it's just a question to ask to help start framing, well, how many stages do we actually need and what's the purpose of those stages?
And then I guess tying back into the delegations as well, Brian, is where does this funding have to come from for different areas and depending on the stage as well?
Yeah, and look, that's a good point, Ali, because often we see within a lot of innovation programs, the feasibility funding is often managed by the innovation program. And then often as projects start progressing through the pipeline, if you like, the owners within the business units are asked to submit funding or to provide funding to be able to take them to that next stage. So, different people, different skills around innovation in some cases, different perception of risk and risk management, and all of those things start to come into play again in terms of how many stages, but then coming back to those earlier slides, for each stage within an innovation stage gate system, you need to work out, well, what information do we need to collect to be able to sort of help make a decision as to whether something progresses or not. Who's going to make that decision, and then what's the criteria, in terms of doing that. And this is the challenge, and we'll touch on a bit later on, but sometimes stage gates can get really complex, and it's sort of nearly more like was the Canva boards? I think that you got boards that you sort of basically just sort of build out for your internal thinking and ideas about where things are up to, rather than decision points. And I think this is the challenge often with a lot of stage gates is it a hard decision point about progressing something through, or are we setting up a stage gate just so we can help manage, if you like, the number of ideas that we've got going at any one time? And it's both work, but it's sort of, the more stages you've got, the often harder it is to actually clarify, who's going to be involved, what information is going to be required, and it becomes looser in terms of decision making.
And building that business case for funding.
Yeah.
That ties well into our next point, which is around the process of being adopted for business as usual.
Yep. So, and again, there's probably a bit of a common theme coming through with a lot of these questions, because they're all back end of funnel questions, because this is where we see a lot of the challenges occurring. So who makes the decision about turning a really good product or service concept or a new process change into business as usual? And how does that actually work? Do you need to run pilots? What sort of information is going to be required to turn that into business as usual? The third dot point there in the second part of that about internal budget cycles is a question that we often ask and delve into, because that often has really big implications in terms of launching potential new products or services in particular. Because if you're going to have to go all through the validation, then sit on your hands for 6 months because it wasn't in the budget cycle, often momentum's lost, and there's a whole range of issues that start to come into play. So that's where it's important to sort of understand that handover, if you like, about, how does this actually get turned into business as usual? Like, what is our organisation's approach around that? And the bottom points there on this slide is, for some organisations, business as usual is a licensing play. So, for example, within research organisations, in a lot of cases, their stage gate system and the outcome of that is a licensing of the tech to another entity. And so for that, it's not so much about how do you turn it into business as usual, but how will you get value out of it? How will licensing occur? How will handover actually occur from the research team, if you like, to the actual commercial partners that are taking on that particular bit of technology?
Yeah, and I think one thing that we don't have in this slide is around risk management with this handover, especially when you've done all of this work to get a project to being able to be incorporated into BAU. What happens when something that does happen out of nowhere? And I mean, we're all very familiar with disruption at the moment. So in the case where an emergency response is needed or restructure happens and that takes over the priority of this implementation, do you have a set process for being able to park the implementation of the idea, and then who's responsible for that?
Yep.
Okay.
So this point 5 is closely aligned with the previous point, but it's really about the minimum information required for project handover. So, say we're talking about manufacturing, your sort of validation activities might take a particular product or service idea through to, ready for business as usual. Well, what's required then from a documentation perspective to allow that to occur? Is it picking up on international standards for deployment? How do those documents get built out? It's sort of, there's a lot of information that's often required to get something adopted, because there's the handover part, but then there's also the dissemination and the embedding in. So how do you train staff up? How do you train salespeople up? How do you get marketing teams on board? It's sort of, there's a lot of information that needs to be handed over to enable a new product or service to actually be successfully commercialized, if you like. Even though we often use this term commercialization more from a startup-y sort of perspective, but the same approach works within any organization. There's a lot of work that's needed and a lot of training and skills and things like that and engagement to enable a new initiative to be rolled out successfully.
Absolutely. And then linking back to the previous slide as well is to consider the timeframes around what this would require. How long does it take for this knowledge transfer? Yeah.
No, exactly.
Okay, number 6.
So point 6. So this is sort of starting to look at, well, the value of getting multiple divisions involved in the selection process. You know, if they will actually be involved, you know, if they're going to be involved in implementation, when to actually bring them into the stage gate system. So there's often, and it's a fine line, and you would have gathered with a lot of these questions, there's not a set and forget stage gate system. It's all about how it works for the organisation to get deployment, adoption, outcomes, and value. And often one of the challenges is, okay, well, we want to bring in subject matter experts or others into the process. Sometimes bringing them in too early can be just as problematic as bringing them in too late. I'll give an example. We were working with a large mining company, and they were finding that they were actually really struggling to get transformative ideas out of the front stage, if you like, of their stage gate process. When we were reviewing what was going on, we found the actual problem was that they had subject matter experts doing a lot of really early review work and you know, what was going to stay in and what was going to be rejected. And what was happening was those subject matter experts were making that decision based on their perception about ease of implementation. So because often at an early stage within a stage gate, you don't have a huge amount of information, they were knocking those things out. And so, you know, while it was good that there was that, if you like, very practical technical lens being put over those early stage ideas or early in the pipeline, the challenge was that they were knocking out a lot of things early that probably needed a little bit of iteration work to see whether something was there or not. And that's what ended up happening, was that the recognition was that for some of this early stage stuff, it needed to go through a slightly different approach to allow a little bit more information to be collected, to be starting to make some decisions. You know, the flip side is you leave that engagement really late, and then they're knocking it out after you've spent $50,000 or $100,000 on a validation project, and that's equally problematic. So there's not a one size fits all, but it's also just flagging challenges with sometimes bringing subject matter experts in a bit too early if they've got the framing about how they would implement from that available information.
Yeah, Victoria agrees as well. She's mentioning it's important to be explicit about which stage a particular functional team member are brought into the project, and important to onboard them as well.
Yeah, that onboarding is a really good point, because, you know, coming back to that example I just gave, if they're not onboarded and they're not understanding the validation approach and the risk management about collecting, you know, information to, you know, we call it sort of replacing assumptions with facts, then yeah, they'll make judgment calls the wrong way, and they'll knock things out that probably, as I said, just need a little bit more time to gather a bit more information to be able to make that decision.
I think in particular when you're involving external stakeholders as well, because often your subject matter experts may be from a partner.
Yeah.
So yeah, that onboarding and understanding what the process is and why they're involved to begin with, yeah, it's critical.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next one, number 7.
Yeah, so number 7 is sort of looking more at the minimum amount of information that's required before allowing entry to the pipeline. Now, this one is generally done reasonably well. There's a lot more experience in sort of, looking at, what do we want in and what out, around defining the challenge. If you're doing challenge-based and spending a lot of time on defining that challenge, looking for least effort approaches to bringing ideas into a funnel. But it's worthwhile looking at this more from this balancing a little bit from particularly a portfolio mix perspective. So often, first step of setting up an innovation program is to set up a strategy. We tend to do operational plans as well, because strategy is one thing, but then you need how you're going to do it. But as part of that process, often a portfolio framework is done, a horizons type framework. And it's really important to revisit that, particularly if it's had board sign off or senior exec sign off, because then it starts to influence a little bit about the types of initiatives you're going to be running, but then also this entry point piece about the information that's required. And this is where it's sometimes useful, depending on how large your innovation program is, to have multiple stage gate processes for different types of initiatives, collecting different types of information at the start that sort of helps you manage the portfolio a bit more.
It's perfect you touched on that, Brian, because Matt actually had a question around if you've got any examples of using a portfolio approach, in particular when you're considering the complementary potential benefits and resources, rather than just looking at a single initiative itself.
Yeah, look, it comes, managing and measuring portfolios is really important over time. Because essentially you'll have different initiatives at different stages, but then you're also wanting to respond to different priorities, if you like, of the organisation. So for those of you who have attended previous events where we've been talking about the ISO Innovation Management Standards, there's a document that's going to be hopefully coming out in the middle of the year, where we're sort of looking at the measurement of innovation management systems, and particularly this stage gate system that we're talking about. So I was fortunate enough to be involved in writing of the portfolio measurement section of that. And the big thing that we were looking at there was, how does the portfolio align back to the strategy of the organisation? So an innovation management system should really help drive strategy implementation. And so it's then starting to look at what are some of those strategic elements that the organisation is trying to progress, and then making sure the portfolio is aligned with those things, and we can measure whether we're achieving some of those objectives or not.
That's going to be an amazing resource once it is released.
Yeah, it's early drafts. And again, I've mentioned this in previous sessions. It gives a lot of examples of different KPIs in particular, and it's going to be a really good resource for people.
Great. Okay, so number 8.
Yeah, so, and this is always a fun one in terms of when to kick initiatives out of your pipeline. And I suppose, again, it sort of starts to sort of determine your stage gates. Picking up on an earlier comment in chat about sticking to criteria. This is where it gets a little bit hard, because you get to a point where you say, okay, we've run this assessment. It might be a scorecard or whatever you're using for an assessment at a particular stage gate. Here are our top 5 or 6 we're taking through, and we're going to drop these 10. Now, that's a difficult thing, because, pardon me, as an innovation manager, there's going to always be that thing of, oh, is there one there that we should have kept, or, is it going to, are we making a mistake in terms of knocking these things out? And you start to sort of fudge things a little bit. It's difficult. Ali made the point earlier that you get changes in the operating environment, and I think this is the best way of approaching removing initiatives out of your stage gate system, is that at this particular point in time, based on the available information and based on the criteria, it doesn't fit. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a great idea. It doesn't mean that it's not going to fit in the future. But at this particular point in time, with the available information, it doesn't fit. And so having that as the framing helps to remove things. The other part that, and there's often a lot of debate as to whether ideas that are removed from a pipeline should be ditched completely or put into an archive and revisited. I suppose, and everyone has their own views. From my perspective, it's actually better to park and revisit, mainly because what happens over time is that there's a change in the operating environment and there's a change in knowledge. And so, let's use online delivery as an example. 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there could have been an initiative coming through about changing everything to online delivery. It may not have got up for all sorts of reasons, relationship building, but then there's been this massive change that we've gone through in the last couple of years in the operating environment, that all of a sudden that idea or that concept really has legs. And we, to be able to go back and revisit and pick up and repurpose is useful. Now, that's a bit of an extreme example with COVID, but the same thing happens with competitors. This idea was not going to fly for whatever reason, and then there's a big change, and then there's an overseas competitor that's doing something similar, and they've managed to make it work. That with a bit of tweaking, you can take things forward. So, as I said, it's a contentious one, but that's the way that we tend to approach it.
Absolutely. And if you think of speed to market as well, when you are faced with change like that, if you've done all of this work today and you've got it sitting there to build on and refresh, rather than starting from scratch again and scrambling.
Yeah, and it's coming back again to timing in the pipeline. I can get the maybe dropping things at the first stage gate type thing, that, that if it's not a fit with the organisation, I use the all the time, the idea that comes in that, to improve productivity, we need better coffee or something like that. If that's been dropped off, that's probably fine. It's more as you take initiatives through the pipeline and you've started spending time and effort on them, they're probably the ones that are close to being aligned, but maybe not fully. And so, again, you don't want to clog it up too much, but there's ways of sort of managing that, if you like.
Definitely. And I think it's important to note as well, in that go back and listen section on the side, when we talk about customers, it's also important to think about your internal customers. It's not just your external market.
Yep.
Okay, number 9.
Yep. So again, when we're sort of starting to look at stage gates, often a question we start to ask is about, well, what's the leadership team or the board expecting in terms of reporting? Some don't have any perceptions, and you can influence that in terms of determining the types of reporting that you think from an innovation team perspective are going to be useful. But often we find that if you don't ask this question, you can assume that they've got no views, and they do. And then all of a sudden you've set up this process and someone comes back and says, no, well, we need a report on this. And it just starts, it slows down the process. As soon as you get senior execs and boards poking holes in the innovation program, it just becomes frustrating. So often asking the question about, well, what do they want from reporting, And as I said, if they say, oh, we don't know, tell us, that's great. You've set up, again, in terms of designing the stage gate process, you can set that up and explain the reporting that you propose. But if they do come back and they say that, we need a report before any expenditure, or we need a report at the business case stage before you even assess it, or mobilise inter-team resources, or whatever it is. And so, if they've got a view, then at least you can, take that into account as you're sort of mapping out the process.
And Callum shared a really insightful approach that he tends to use in terms of a co-design workshop. So with key stakeholders, particularly those who you earmark as the committee members, yep. Using this approach to work out obvious issues and get buy-in and teach by doing. I love that. And then the back-end broader consultation around the outcomes that co-design approach, including getting the co-design team to pitch and defend it to senior executives. I think that's fantastic.
Yep. No, and look, it is about, and I agree exactly, Callum, with what you're saying there and the approach, but it all comes back down to what's needed internally as well. Some like that whole pitching and defend type piece. Others like this multiple teams coming together. Some love Shark Tank scenarios, which are a bit, anyway, won't go there. But yeah, it's about understanding levels of involvement. When do they want to get involved? But it's all about the decision-making piece. So one of the challenges we see all the way through with a stage gate is of just thinking through, well, what information is needed to make a decision, and particularly later in a stage gate system. If you're talking about execs needing to mobilise $500,000 or something to roll out a new product, what confidence levels do they need in the data? What data do they actually need to be able to make these decisions? And it starts to influence this whole, well, how are they involved? Who's involved? And those sorts of things. Anyone that's interested, we've actually built out a complexity diagram around turning an idea into a product or service. And so, with a lot of groups, we sort of sit down and we look at that as part of a stage gate design process, because it is about what information we want to capture around regulatory, or around IP, or around what does value actually mean to internal and external customers and things like that. So if any of that's of interest, happy to touch base afterwards, because it is that sort of stuff, again, builds into the back end, if you like, of stage gates.
I think another point to consider, and this was touched on in our last month's event for anyone that tuned in, is around who you're reporting to, how you're actually communicating that, and think of it on the individual level and the personality type even, and how do they prefer to receive reporting. So it could be that they're expecting extensive documentation and wanting to analyze that data, or it could be that they actually prefer a stand-up presentation and an overview. So just taking into the communication style, taking that into account as well.
Yep.
Okay.
That's it.
Last one, number 10.
Number 10. So this is sort of one starting to look at how to actually communicate what's going on. And it's really about the stages make sense. So if you're talking to, if your innovation program is very focused on engaging with staff, if you are talking to them about various stages, can you explain it? Is it easy to explain, or is it quite difficult? Now, this isn't a drop dead type issue, but it just makes it easier to engage others in the process. So particularly, mid-stage, later stage in a stage gate system, you're wanting to bring in other stakeholders, and if they can't really understand the terminology, or they can't understand what needs to happen, it takes a lot longer to try to get people up to speed. The other thing with that, and I'll talk about it in terms of terminology, is that you can use a word to describe a stage gate, and that word will mean different things to different people. And yeah, try it out. I'll tell the story. I was, in a previous life, I used to design overseas development projects. And so I was in India once working on a design of a big program over there. And we kept using this term sustainability when we were talking to government reps and industry and things like that. And we couldn't work out why we were running into problems. And then we started, one of the guys I was with, he said, we need definitions every time we go into a meeting. And we started asking, what do you think the word sustainability means? What does it mean to you? And we were getting anything from financial sustainability to environmental to whatever. And we found that the problem with just a simple word was because there were different perceptions, it actually stopped or changed the way that we're gathering information. Same thing with stage gates. If you use a term, it's often about trying to describe that term or make sure that it's not a term that is going to throw people off what you're trying to achieve for that particular stage as well. So it's worthwhile asking that question. Call it proof of concept. Ask people, what do they think that means? Get an understanding and be able to influence what that meaning is, because it can mean different things to different people.
Absolutely. So when thinking about the context of your innovation system and program as a whole, if you're going through the process of setting up what that common language is of innovation, then taking into account the stage gate is a big part of that.
Yep. That's it.
So in summary, we've gone through our 10 points: process to mobilize resource, financial delegations, what's our resourcing budget, and how is that allocated, what's the process for BAU adoption, and then what is the process around project handover, division involvement for selection or external involvement, minimum information required for your pipeline entry, when to stop or when to revisit, reporting expectations and to who, and then does it make sense?
Yep. So just before you jump to the next slide, Ali, Andrew, and good to catch up, Andrew, virtually, had a question about innovation advisory panels, and definitely. At each stage that you're going through a process, whether you're using internal team members to make a decision to take something forward or external, it doesn't really matter. You can use whoever to do that, but again, what they're doing is they've got documentation in front of them, a criteria list, and then they're making that decision based on the available information that's put in front of them to be able to, again, do a ranking system or a scorecard or something along those lines. But definitely bringing in externals, sort of just revisiting that comment earlier about subject matter experts and just the timing of bringing some of those in, or and I forget who it was, made a comment about the training, might have been Carol, I can't quickly find it, but the briefing and the training of them is really important, so they understand the stage that it's up to, that if they're assessing it early on, that there won't be a lot of information, and they're making the decision based on that, not and that's different to later on in the stage gate, where it might be a fully blown we've validated this bit of tech, it's at a TRL level of 7 or something. There's more information, and it's sometimes easier to make decisions, or you may be making different decisions at that point.
So the last thing we just wanted to run through is, when thinking about reviewing a stage gate process, just our approach as to what we would recommend.
Yeah, and so look, this is just explaining what we do. Often we'll workshop an innovation stage gate system and try to work out where it's failing. And there can often be some really interesting points. Like we've had ones where a group were doing a lot of research, for example, and they couldn't get research outcomes into their internal stage gate system. It just wasn't aligning. And so sitting down and really understanding, unpacking a lot of those challenges and what was going wrong. And then we generally build up a mock one, if you like, or a concept brief about a modified version. And then we sort of work with the innovation team to present it to management, then we test it, and then look at more the performance indicators to try to judge whether the stage gate's delivering the outcomes that we're aiming for. So there's different ways of doing it, but we just thought we'd share at the end of this one how a lot of these questions that we use, how we sort of start to use them in practice.
So on that note, thinking about actions to implement moving forward, we would love to hear from everyone just quickly at the end as we're wrapping up. Was there a standout question that really resonated with you? And did you have any ideas to implement moving forward from today?
Yeah, this is where you guys all have to work now. I've finished. But just while you're thinking of that, I'd love to be able to sit in a presentation and say, this is the way you design a stage gate. But coming back to, I suppose, that systems thinking and design-led thinking comment right at the start, that the stage gates need to align with the system that you're working within. If they don't, what we tend to find, we talk more about that overall innovation management system. Even if it doesn't align with what the organisation's doing, we call it a rogue innovation program. And there's a lot of them out there. Innovation managers get very frustrated with internal systems that are within their organisation. And so they start going off on a tangent. They set up stage gates that are external to that without, sometimes that's approved, and I can talk about that some other time, but often they're not. And when they're not is when it becomes really difficult, and they find innovation programs get shut down after a couple of years because the outcome of the innovation program doesn't feed back into adding value to the organisation. And so that's when boards and senior execs shut down innovation programs.
So we've had a couple of comments. So BAU adoption and aligning to enterprise financial delegations, and the importance of understanding what information decision makers require at each gate is vital.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, well, that was the session that we had today, everyone. So we do have a couple minutes left. Happy to stay on if anyone has any further questions. Feel free to pop them in, or alternatively, don't hesitate to reach out to Brian and I. We've got another comment here from Michael. So when assembling an innovation team within an organisation, what advice would you give to pull together the right people to achieve good outcomes? Brian, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no worries, Michael. Look, the big thing I'd probably start with is looking at the strategy of the organisation and what the objectives are, because then you start to, if you start at that basis first, then you're starting to look at, let's say it's to identify new potential products that can be new to the Australian market, just picking a topic. So then you can start looking at, well, what do we want to start having the innovation system look like? So what types of ideas are we going to be sourcing? What resources do we need to, and divisions do we need to engage with to be able to get that through a process that we can deliver these new to Australian market products? So that might be scouting for what others are doing overseas, and then there might be the marketing division, there might be normal operations, there could, whatever. And that starts to then determine who you get involved with an innovation program. An alternative could be around, if it's more around process improvement and working across the whole organisation, and bringing them on, well, then that's more of a senior executive type play around key challenges that different divisions are facing, and then how you help those senior execs solve those challenges. So so then that starts to influence who might want to go first, second, third, and how you start engaging across divisions from there. So hopefully, that helps.
And when thinking about different skill sets, or I guess roles within an innovation team, we also have a blog up on our website that gives a high-level overview if that's of help as well.
Yeah.
We had another comment from Andrew. It wasn't touched on today, but yeah, when thinking about the broader innovation program or system, emphasis on innovation coaching for senior leadership in advance of setting it up. Yeah, definitely valuable activity to carry out if you are able to do so.
Yeah, and I've said this in a few presentations previously, so apologies if you heard this before, but yeah, one of the greatest moments I had was when an innovation manager, we were in a meeting, and he ran off and he brought back a book that one of his directors had picked up at an airport. Again, this is a couple of years ago now, but but that was the big thing for him, was that there was a director who previously wasn't really supportive of the innovation program, had picked up a book, read it, thought it was really good, and then discussed it with the innovation manager. So that's really good buy-in, and it just made the innovation manager's life so much easier because of that buy-in.
Right. Last comment here. So Matthew's mentioned, so agreeing with Marissa, in companies that go ahead with large-scale operational or strategic projects, you do need dedicated capacity. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's it. And it's challenging at times because a lot of innovation managers are part-time, or they've got part-time teams. It is that point where, particularly when you're starting to work across a whole, like a large organization, just how much time a lot of the conversations take. And a lot of boards and senior execs, unless they've been really actively involved in innovation programs, often dismiss that, and it makes it a bit hard.
Absolutely. Well, we might wrap up there, everyone. Thank you very much again for joining us today. Thank you, Brian, as well, for sharing all of your insights. I hope that everyone stays safe over the next few weeks, and that you got some value out of today. So we'll be sending the recording out as mentioned, and we'll also pop up a blog that you can socialize if it's going to be of help. Okay. Thanks again, and we'll see you later.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.